schedule, I think, and try to do this. So, welcome everybody to our return of the VIDI seminar, which I'm glad you guys could all attend. We're fortunate enough to have a great first speaker. That's always great to start off with a high-powered speaker. So we have David Stromberg from Stockholm University is going to talk about social media and collective action in China. Just a reminder for those of you who either haven't been to the seminar or have forgotten because we've been on hiatus for a bit. The seminar lasts for 60 minutes. The first 45 minutes is primarily David presenting the work. If you have clarifying questions, put them in the chat. Tommy, who's the co-organizer for this year with myself, will collect questions, and if there's kind of something mostly clarifying that's germane, he'll try to interrupt and mention it so David can clarify it, and then the last 15 minutes people can ask questions. Okay, so without further ado, let me turn things over to David, and yeah.
Thanks. Thanks for inviting me for this talk, to give this talk. So I'm going to talk about this paper, which is joint work with Yanhui Wu at Hong Kong University and Beijing at Hong Kong Baptist University. So there are a couple of papers on social media and protests out there. And what's new in our paper, we think, are two things. One is that China is a much more strictly controlled media environment than any of the other studies. Like they study the Arab Spring or Russia in 2011. It's just much, much more censored and controlled. For example, in the Rubin and Polikov et al. Paper on Russia, in most of the cities, there are groups who organize protests on social media, explaining, saying when and where to meet. And we just don't see any of those tweets in Chinese social media. So we wonder, can social media still spread protests and strikes in that type of environment? And we think it's interesting because China is like a leader in censoring technology. They have state-of-the-art technical tools to censor the internet, and as some studies have shown, they're also exporting that type of technology now to other countries. So the other thing which we think is a novelty is that we study the impact of social media on how events spread from city to city. So in China, small and localized protests are allowed. So we think that maybe that's because they help the Chinese government to identify important social problems, local problems, maybe local corrupt officials, so they can use these protests as a monitoring device. And in any case, we see lots of small protests in China. Of course, what's concerning for the top leaders is if these small local protests spread into nationwide movements, which potentially challenge the national party, or at least focus on national issues that may reduce the legitimacy of the ruling party. So the method here, so we will use the rapid expansion of social media in China to identify effects. So we can measure how information spreads from city to city, that is how connected cities are through social media, and how that changes over time. And as I will explain in a minute, when social media came to China, we will look at Twitter in China, which is called Sina Weibo, or the Twitter equivalent. And at the time of the entry of Weibo, the social media environment in China was basically vacant. So Twitter and Facebook had been banned after alleged involvement in or use in some protests in the Urumqi region. So there was basically no social media. And then over a few years, the number of social media users in China went from 0 to around 500 million in 2012, from 29 to 2012. We will look at that enormous change and use that as a identifying variation. So we will then measure the connections between cities. We want to see if a protest in one city spreads to another city, depending on how well connected these cities are informationally. And we measure the information flows through social media, through tweets and retweets. So we know, like when a tweet is tweeted, the user who tweets the tweet, where he's located, and also the person who retweets. So we can see a tweet in city A is being retweeted by a user in city B, then we know that information has flown from city A to city B. So we have millions of such retweets, which we would use as a measure of communication across cities. So just a short overview of results. So we find that despite there being no information essentially about organization of protests or strikes, we see that it spreads information. Oh, first, the information part. We can see how information about these tweets spread across China. We see that that spread is very fast and wide. So fast within 2 days and wide across course and industry. So should not be information here, spreads protests and strikes fast and wide. So across course and industry, what that means is that we know the causes of protests or the problems that they are protesting against. So this could be, for example, government corruption or some land grabbing or other. And what we can see is that through social media, the main spread is within one type of protest, a protest for one cause, to a protest of the same cause. So protesting about government corruption spreads to protests about government corruption. But we also see that it spreads to other causes. And similarly, for strikes, we find that manufacturing strikes spread mainly into manufacturing strikes through social media, but they also spread to other strikes in other industries. And even though this cross-industry, cross-cause spread is smaller in magnitude per event, the aggregate implication of that type of spread is more important because there's just more events across all causes, across all industries. So that just is more important in the aggregate. And finally, we find that this spread through social media of these protest events dramatically increases the probability of very large event waves. And we measure an event wave by the number of, like the amplitude, by the number of events taking place for the same, through the same wave, for the same cause in the same week. And so I will talk more about that. But just one fine point here is that because social media influences the spread of protest, that increases the variance of the protest waves, the volatility, in the same way as if you have an AR1 process, and if you get stronger feedback in the AR1 coefficient, you get a larger variance. So what a larger variance means is that it increases the probability of tail events. So it increases the probability of a very large number of cities protesting at the same time. So the mechanism that we find is consistent with these results. So we find that it cannot be, they're not using social media to organize protests or strikes explicitly. They're not saying, let's meet in Tahrir Square, tomorrow or next week. That's not the mechanism. Instead, it could spread either through an emotional reaction. So I see a protest about something which I'm already upset about, and I see someone is protesting about that in another city, and I get even more upset, and I just protest. So this is like Tabellini Passarelli has a model of this spread through emotional reactions. It could also be just that is, if someone else is protesting, then it's better for me to protest at the same time. both because if we're more cities protesting for the same cause, it may be more likely that we get some concessions from the government. It's a bigger movement. It may also reduce the risk of repression. There's also like a China-specific version of this argument, which is that if you see someone else is protesting, then that signals that there's a window of opportunity. Right now, maybe protests are allowed to some extent, so I can protest at the same time. So all these things are mechanisms are consistent with our results. So the related literature. So here I already mentioned the work on Russia. There's work on Facebook by Ferguson and Molina and Acemoglu et al., who look at protest incidents and social media in freer media environments. And they also don't look at the spread. Then there's work on ICT and protests. Manakona and Tersey, for example, have a work on that, on mobile phones in Africa and how they're spreading protests. Then there is work on more protest behavior. So Cantoni et al. Have a recent work on protests in Hong Kong, where they look at whether protests are complements or substitute. There's also work by Burschin in that line. It also connects to a large set of papers, which are theoretical papers about protest movements, going back to Granovetter, but more recently, Susanne Lohmann, Marco Battaglino, Barbera, and Jackson. The last paper is the most closely related to ours. First two are more generic about protests. There is also a bunch of papers on social media censoring in China. So Baman is an early paper, Fu is a paper that we use a lot, King et al. Are very highly cited papers. And we also have a recent paper, a 2017 paper on how the effective social media in China can be for government surveillance of protests and strikes and propaganda. Okay, so background. So social media in China are hugely popular. And I basically said this already. So it was introduced in 2009, 500 reported users in 2012. And Weibo is a platform for breaking news and political commentary, much like Twitter. For the protests and strikes, we see numerous instances, lots of protests and strikes in the past 2 decades. The government response is nuanced. So sometimes there's like violent repression, leaders are arrested, but there's also concessions. Like sometimes the upper level government will step in and say, here's clearly some local malfeasance, and they correct the issue. The potential reasons for the upper level governments to allow protest could be that China has an enormous agency problem. Like it's a very large country, and you have these local leaders which are extremely powerful, and it's difficult for the center to know exactly what's going on in all locations. But protests and strikes are a costly signal for a way for people to signal that there's something wrong happening, and it could be very useful for the central government to see these. Is there something problematic happening somewhere in China? Here's a protest. Why are people protesting? So it could be useful for that reason. So the protests in our data. So we have around 1,100 protests between 2006 and 2013, and then 1,600 protests 2014 to 2017. The most common cause for a protest is government policy or corruption. And the second one is housing and land. So housing and land is basically that local governments convert land that used to be for agricultural use into commercial land. So people don't own individuals don't own land in China, but they have usage rights. So local farmers may have the right to use land for agriculture for a long time. And but the local governments can convert this land into commercial land, which has much higher value. And then the original users don't feel that they are sufficiently compensated, so they protest. That's the second most common protest type. So the data source here is Radio Free Asia. So they have some correspondence in China, but then they also look at media outlets. The strike data, here you see 1,500 strikes in the first period and 8,000 strikes in the later period. The most common strike type, so here is manufacturing, followed by transportation. And the source here is the China Labor Bulletin. So their source in turn is that they have a network of labor activists in China that report these strikes to them, but they also use media, internet, and blogs. In particular, one blog, which was called Wicked Donna, which existed 2013 to 2016. So the social media data that we use we have two types of data. One is just the counts of the number of tweets per prefecture. So prefecture is like a city. In China, there are around 330 some prefectures, and month. So here, in total, the overall data set that we have is 13.2 billion tweets. And then we have like collapsed that, so we know the number of tweets per location, per city, and month. This is just a measure of the penetration. Then we have data of the individual tweets. So out of the 13.2 billion tweets, most of those tweets are just about, people write about their cats or like funny stuff that we're not interested in. So we selected around 5,000 keywords related to various social and political topics, like all political positions, the names of all listed companies, top politicians, words to do with pollution, corruption, other social issues. So we have 5,000 keywords like that to extract 202 billion tweets, which talk about these social issues. And then we have 133 million retweets of these tweets. So the retweets are just the first retweet of a tweet, not the retweet of the retweet. But that's the two types of data that we have. So here's just a description of those posts. So we find that the tweets about protests and strikes. So we have a number of words related to protests and strikes that we just pre-wrote. And then we see how many tweets contain these words. And then we see how many of these are actually about protests and strikes. So this first part is just hot topics, like overrepresented words in conflict posts, protest tweets, and strike tweets. So the protest tweets will say, ask for compensation, sit-in, demonstrations, self-immolation, parade, etc.
So, David, so sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Hannes has a question. How fast did tweets per month grow in the early sample period when the platform was introduced?
For the first month, so it was introduced in late 2009. It didn't grow very quickly in the first couple of months. I mean, it grows basically exponentially, but in absolute magnitude, it doesn't grow very much. So in 2010, 2011, it has very high, you have a very high number of our Twitter users. But what I wanted to show here is that these tweets about protests and strikes occur in bursts around real-world events. So you can see that here's just a data set where we code conflict, protests, and strikes. So on days where there is an event, you can see that there's around 62 tweets in that city in that day talking about protests, and 163 talking about strikes, 2,000 talking about anti-Japan events. So what's interesting is that you can see that there's clearly a very high amount of these tweets talking about the events the day before the event. So protests, you can see there's 53 tweets mentioning protests the day before the protest, and 48 tweets about strikes before the strike, the day before the strike. So this means that social media are a very effective tool for identifying strikes and protests one day in advance. And in this paper here, which is a different paper than what I'm talking about today, we go into this more in detail. There we show that it's a very efficient way of identifying protests and strikes one day in advance. So it's a very effective surveillance tool. And we also show that we can identify officials who are being charged with corruption 1 year before the first charge based on social media content.
So there are a couple of questions here. So Anton asked a question, as I know, many words in China are prohibited for social media, so similar sounding words with innocent original meaning are used as politically charged. Do you include these?
Sorry, can you say again?
So many words in China are prohibited for social media, so similar sounding words with innocent original meaning are used as politically charged. Did you include these?
I don't remember. I think we included a few of those. So you're right that, so one way of bypassing censorship is to just extract a word that has you just replace a word for another word and all the users know what that really means. So the problem with that, to answer your question, we did include some of those words that we knew. But as a more general response, that's not a very efficient way of evading censorship. The reason is that all these modern large language models, what they do extremely well is to predict what other words are used as this word. So it's very easy. And if you're going to convey something to a large group of people, and everyone knows that this really means something else, it means that the censors are also going to know that. So, yeah.
So a related question, Alessandro asked a related question, what method did you use to generate these keywords you use in your analysis?
No, we just started, it was an iterative method where we started with a few keywords and we saw what posts does this draw, and then we found new keywords in those, but it's not an algorithm that I can tell you. Okay. So we find these bursts of protest and strike tweets occurring around the dates of the actual events. And then we can see how information about these protests and strikes are spreading across social media through the retweets. So that a user retweets a message means that at least the user has seen it. So it's like one measure of information transmission. So we have around 37 million retweets of these tweets. And we observe the direct retweets, as I said, not the retweet of the retweets. But then we can see that the retweets, people read these tweets really quickly. So 30% of the retweets are done within 1 hour, and 80% within 1 day. It's also that they disseminate geographically very quickly. After the first hour, the mean distance between the tweeting and the retweeting user is the same as the unconditional mean distance between users. So here's the measuring the strength of communication between cities. So our measure of communication between cities would be the number of retweets in A from tweets in B on topics other than protests and strikes 6 months prior to 1 month prior to the current date. And here's just an anecdote of an event of the type that we want to capture. So this is a wage dispute So in January 18 in 2013, a migrant worker in Guangzhou detonated his bomb vest after his wage wasn't paid. The same day, we can see in our data 374 posts talking about these events being sent from users in Guangzhou. These were widely forwarded by users in 9 prefectures that are closely connected to Guangzhou using our measure. And then in the next subsequent 2 days, 3 of these 9 prefectures experienced similar protests. So this is just an anecdote. We see something happening, we see tweets, we see people are reading them, then we see events in these things, in these other places. And what we want to do now is to see if this is something that's happening systematically. And the econometric model that we're using, so the above story in equation form, is that there is an event in location J at time t-1, and then Fijt is the media connectedness between this city J and another city I. And if it's highly connected, then that increases the probability of an event the next day in city I. So YIT is a binary dummy for event day T in prefecture J. And Fij is social media connectedness between city I and J. Of course, this is just one city. We need to look at like the inflow of all events in the past day and how connected those cities were with this current city. So we take the sum, just a linear model, and we call this beta times SIT. So this part here is just the SIT, the spread part. We would also use, this is time varying connections. So it would be through social media. So before 2009, this would just be 0. And then it would be measured by the number of retweets between city I and city J in the past 6 months. But here we will use like a time invariant measure of the average connection between city I and city J in the post period. And the reason we want to do that is because then we can look at pre-trends. So the identification issues here are like the common things which are in network effects. So one is that Fij, social media connections are correlated with other types of connections. Obviously, you know, if you have friends in another place, you talk to them over the phone and you have them on Facebook. So it's correlated with other information channels. It's also the case that people tend to communicate more, or regions, communication ties are stronger between similar places. So people with many highly educated people communicate with other cities with highly educated people. But that also means that shocks are correlated. So suppose that, you know, places with a large manufacturing industry communicate a lot with other places with a large manufacturing industry. Then there's a shock to manufacturing, increasing unemployment. You see strikes in city A and city B. It has nothing to do with social media. It's just that they are correlated shocks. So what our invention here is that we can estimate these things, these other factors in the pre-period before Sina Weibo. We can see how our protests and strikes spreading between cities that eventually became connected through social media in the pre-period when there was no social media. Then we only have these correlated and contextual effects. So we can measure those and then partial them out from the additional social media effect. So here's doing that. So beta naught is the amount of spread between cities that became connected through social media in period 1, but they're not yet. This is before 2009. So you can see there's some spread, but it's not significant. And then beta 1 is the period between up until 2013. There you see significant spread, and also in the period after 2013. So we split the period because our Weibo data is only up until 2013. So in this beta 2, we're assuming that the connections, as we measure them in the earlier period is a good proxy for the connections between cities in this later period. So here's just the geodistance spread. We can also do like dynamic effects. So now we are, instead of splitting it just into 2 periods, we're splitting it by biannual periods. So you can see that before social media was introduced in 2009, there was no additional spread between cities that became connected. But then in 2009, 2010, as social media is rolled out, it increases rapidly. And then for protests, the effects fall after 2014 around. And this is strongly, we believe, that this has to do with a much stricter media regulation in China after 2014, as measured by Freedom House and others. So for strikes, we just see the increase in the spread. So it starts spreading across cities that became connected through social media when social media was being rolled out. And then it stays at the spread stays at a high level. We think that this is because strikes are not politically sensitive in the way that protests are. Robustness, we do a bunch of robustness tests. We first just check that there's no mechanical zero effect in the pre-period because we have fewer events. We also show that we can rule out, consistently test the null of no effect, even if Weibo increases the observability of events. The reason is that we're measuring the spread. So even though if you have more Weibo, if Weibo social media are being used to observe events, we see more events in city A and city B, but we don't see proportionally more events in city B happening just after events in city A, just because observability increased. So this is why, even though observability may be driven by social media, we can still test this null hypothesis of zero spread from Weibo. So that's this part. We also add a bunch of controls where we just see, do these spread occur differentially? Does it increase more across more populous areas? Is it correlated with all our predetermined variables? And we see that does not affect our results. We also do like an IV where we instrument social media connections across cities with student mobility. So we know which places cities students are from and which cities they go to in college. And that's a strong predictor of social media ties between cities. Okay, so we then look at the speed and duration of these spread effects. And we find that these events spread very quickly. So they start spreading even one day after, but they have a very short duration. So the spread, it just spreads to the next city in the first 1 or 2 days, and then it just dies out very quickly, both for protests and strikes. And here, we next look at whether social media can break the industry and cause bounds. So for the political leadership in general, it's important whether protest is just narrow in scope and narrow in groups. Does it spread? Does it just is it contained within manufacturing workers, or does it spread also to students and other groups in society? So here we see that social media are spreading events within protest cause and strike industry much more within than across. So here's the across event spread. You can see that this is like a factor 8 smaller. The across is much smaller per event. But even though these are smaller, the aggregate implications of the cross-industry spread are larger because here's like the mean within a category number of events. It's just, 0.0013, whereas the mean across all categories, just more events. So this effect dominates this smaller magnitude in the spread per event coefficient. Okay. The next thing we wanted to do is to look at the functional form. So we basically wanted to see, as the protest waves grow, do protests just spread more and more? Or is the effect linear, or what does it look like? So it turns out that for most of the region where we have data, so the solid line here, 99% of our data is below this line and this line. And in this region, the effect is roughly linear. But for high values, so then it increases, but then when the protest becomes sufficiently large, they just die out. There's no feedback. This could either be because if you protest for a certain type of cause, like corruption or land use, it can only spread to a certain number of cities. After all, those cities who care about this are part of the protest. It cannot spread anymore, so it sort of dies out. It could also be that if the protest becomes large enough, then there's some government intervention which shuts down communication in this area. In any case, we see that for high values, the feedback dies out. And this is extremely important when you want to estimate the size, the aggregate amplitude of the wave, because it turns out that the feedback down here is so large so that the wave is accelerating. This is like in an AR process with a AR coefficient greater than 1. So the only reason the waves stay out is this. So we use these estimated response functions to simulate data on the event waves with and without social media. So the data is the black line. The simulated data with these estimated functions is the red dots. And the red dots with these bars is the simulations of the hypothetical case that there was no social media. So we can see that even without social media, the number of protests in China the number of cities affected the same week would have increased, but not at all as much as they did with social media. And similarly, here's so the number of cities would have increased for maybe, here you have maybe, I don't know, 2 or 4 to up to 10 without social media, but going up to maybe 28 with social media. So that's one thing. The other part is that you can see that the confidence intervals here are much larger than here. And in general, the confidence intervals without social media are much smaller than the confidence intervals with social media. And the reason is that social media increases the feedback, the autocorrelation coefficient, and that just creates more volatility. So in some simulations, we see like a really high number of cities being affected at the same time under the social, so up until 40 cities at the same time in the simulations with at the 95% interval with social media. So more variance and higher probability of tail events, protests simultaneously affecting a substantial share of the country. Okay, so the mechanisms. So the mechanisms that we don't think explain our findings is explicit coordination. Like most of the other papers who've looked at social media effects on protests have had this as a main mechanism. And some even say that it's a necessary criteria for believing that there would be necessary criteria to believe that social media could affect protest and participation is that messages transmit important details, including information about where and when a given demonstration is taking place. But in China, we just find extremely few posts with this type of content. We believe that this is because of self-censorship and censorship. And so this is just unlikely mechanism. And learning about protest tactics, we also find very few tweets about that. Instead, the main mechanisms consistent with our findings is that people see that people in other cities are protesting, and it's just beneficial for them to protest at the same time because there's higher benefits, higher probability of getting concessions for the government if it's a larger movement, and perhaps also lower costs, less risk of persecution. It could also be an emotional response, as in Passarelli and Tabellini. Many of the posts that we read express anger, and this will also give short-term and widespread effects. Okay, so you might ask yourself, okay, but we don't find that many posts explicitly about organizing protests, but maybe it's because we just don't catch them. Maybe users see them, but we download posts too rarely, so we don't really catch them. Okay, so mechanisms rely on specific content and has on censoring. What content exists after censoring? Can we draw conclusions from like the downloaded posts the way we do?
Sorry,
yeah.
Karthik has a question. How common is peer-to-peer communication in China? Is there a WhatsApp equivalent, and can Weibo posts be shared on these sorts of apps? Are these channels censored?
Okay, yeah. I mean, there are peer-to-peer, very popular peer-to-peer platforms in China. During our first sample period, up until 2013, Weibo was the dominant social media. After that, these other WeChat and other communication social media tools have become more popular. But they are not used as much for these types of political commentary and etc. as are Weibo. But of course, they can use that. There are some studies of censoring of these other platforms, and some people claim it's very similar, others claim it's slightly less strict.
So Strong has another question. So are there any influencers whose tweet may spark significant discussion, and how active are these users?
So we don't use that in this study. I mean, we do have some information about them, and they're, of course, as everywhere else, that would be, but we don't use it here. I'm not certain that the typical influencer with a large follower would retweet lots of things about protests and strikes in China. But so I'm not. I probably think it's probably not important, but it is, of course, an issue, and we're not dealing with it. We tried at point with, yeah, let me not go into that more. Okay, or maybe I can leave it to the end and we can discuss it more. I just want to go through this censoring stuff. So there's two types of censoring in China. We know a lot about censoring from really nice papers by King, Pan, and Roberts, where they set up a fake social media platform and got censoring instructions. So we know a lot about how it's being done. So some tweets are automatically held for review before publication, notably if they, for example, if they contain certain sensitive keywords. then users never see them. They just go directly to the censors, and the censors read them, and then either they post them or they don't. For that type of censoring, we see the same tweets as the regular users. But then there's another type of censoring, which is that if it's not automatically censored, then it's posted, but then it's reviewed by censors while being visible for a while, and then maybe removed or maybe not removed. And here we may see other posts, because the readers may see it before censoring, but then it's removed, so we don't see it. So to evaluate how important this is, we need to know three things. We need to know how fast is censoring after a post is posted, how quick is this second type of censoring, I mean, when they read it and then potentially remove it. How fast do users read the tweets? And how fast is our downloading of the tweets? Those three things are what we need to know. And we have information about all of them. So the censoring speed, other people have measured that. So they just post messages that are with sensitive content, and then they just see how long time does it take for this message to be removed. And this is the line here, censored tweets is like this line here. You see the share of tweets that are eventually censored, that are censored within 10 minutes is around 10–12%. And then after 1 hour, it's like 50%, and 1 day is above 90%. And the reading, so we use retweeting as a proxy for reading. So we can see when a user posts a tweet, and then we can see when it's retweeted. We take that as a measure of reader speed. And this is the reader speed of all tweets, and this is the reader speed of collective action tweets. So you can see that that's faster than censoring. So when a post is tweeted, people just read the post very quickly. So censors don't keep up, but after maybe 10 minutes, the censors are ahead of the readers. So using this type of information, we can estimate that, and then our downloading time is just for most users, we just download every day at random times. So we can estimate that 33% of the users who would eventually read a post, if it wasn't censored, read it before censoring, in the case that it's censored in this way. And 18% of the censored posts are downloaded can we download before they're censored. So the bias, if we take like the frequency on our data relative to user exposure, is like 33/18. So it's like, I don't know, 1.6, 1.8 maybe, but it's not 100. It's not that if we see 2 posts, there are like 200 posts out there, or the exposure is not very high. So it's higher, but it's not hugely higher. Okay, so just concluding. So we find that social media spreads protests and strikes fast and wide. So it's fast, it's within 2 days, and wide, so it spreads it across industries and causes. The mechanism that are consistent with our results are things like emotional reactions, or this simultaneous protest to achieve a common goal or to avoid repression. So we also find that there is this spread, even though, like the papers by King, Pang, and Roberts also show that what censorship in China is really geared at collective action posts, at removing that type of content. In particular, that of organizing protests and strikes that we see, posts with collective action potential. But we see that type of content is not there. But you could imagine that a government wants to remove that type of spread effect, but it still wants to have the surveillance, the information from all the users. So an ideal policy might be, so let's remove all that content, and then we can still use the social media posts about corrupt officials or other types of things that people are unhappy about, to learn about, to monitor local officials and to monitor public opinion. That's really useful. And also, as we showed in our other paper, for surveillance of these protest events. You get like this direct information from the protests and strikes events through social media. But what we find here is that that strategy is not perfect in the sense that you cannot obtain the goal of keeping the type of information that people are posting currently, which is, what is the problem? What are we upset about? And expressing, we're really upset about this issue or about this of this official, because exactly that content is spreading the events through to other cities. So there's a trade-off here. You cannot obtain both those goals, it seems. So anyway, yeah. So there's an unavoidable trade-off between monitoring local officials and gauging public opinion and avoiding event spread. Okay, thanks.
Great. Okay, thanks. Thanks so much, David. That was awesome. So we have about a little less than 10 minutes for comments, questions. So I think the best way to do this is if people raise their hand, and then if you can like unmute yourself, and then David, you can just ask David, and we'll kind of go one at a time. Hopefully this, I guess it's not really lining up for me. David, do you want to is it okay? I don't really want to get in the middle. I think I'm just going to make things worse. Do you want to just like call on people, or just, I don't know what's easiest?
I mean,
yeah.
Well,
yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, Hannes, I guess has a question, and we did have also one from chat.
Hi, thanks. A very nice talk. So I was just wondering, so you mentioned that these protests, they're costly signals to say something's wrong in the local communities. I was wondering if you see, or if there's evidence that the central government actually, sees these and reacts to this. So do they actively monitor the local authorities? Just wondering about that.
So there is evidence that they are reacting sometimes to the protests and giving concessions. I don't have any answer to whether we don't know whether they're doing it systematically. That's just not, information that's available to us. We do know that the local authorities are systematically using social media to monitor local events. So local leaders in China, like city leaders, provincial leaders, have these early warning systems where they look at, people are upset about, or people are posting stuff on social media that's bad for me, and then trying, I don't know what they do with it, but it's an industry in China to siphon that type of information from the social media flow. But I don't know, to your question about the real world protests, it's also important to note that we think it's important that the combination of real world protests and social media tweets is really effective for surveillance or for information. The problem with just social media is that it's not very costly. So people can write petition on social media at like almost zero cost, and there are like tons of these petitions, and there's just people are saying that no one pays attention to this. But the combination of a costly action, like a protest, these people are really risking something. So they signal strongly that they care about this. And then the local leaders can see there's a protest here, and they can also go into the tweets and see exactly what is it that people are protesting about. So the combination of the information plus the signal strength, we think is very useful.
Thanks.
I guess Tommy is next.
Okay, so yeah, just a very quick question. So you said one of the channel could be that the social media Weibo is transmitting some kind of emotions, right? And did you try to do some texture analysis on the tweet or whatever you call it, how angry they are, and then whether those angrier tweets on Weibo actually lead to a high probability of a protest or strike in other places?
No, we did not do that. In the other paper, like the 2017 paper, we did something related, but it wasn't about protests and strikes. It was about local politicians. So then we just looked at the number of times like local politicians were mentioned in social media, and then a sentiment analysis, like how angry are people about these people, local officials. Yeah, but we haven't connected it to how much protests and strikes are spreading. But you're right. We could test that hypothesis potentially by doing that type of heterogeneity analysis.
Sorry, Chin, would you like to?
Okay. Thank you, David, for the presentation. I asked this question in the chat as well. So I think it's probably related to your mechanism of emotional response. I'm thinking about how Chinese people care about the suffering of others. So this is probably a value change we could observe in China. So people increasingly protest for other people's sufferings or for social causes, as we observe in liberal Western countries. And this will be the case for some of the events happening in Xinjiang and during COVID, people protest for things outside of their personal life. And you could see these things happen in developed cities like Shanghai, like in Beijing, in Shenzhen, but not in those underdeveloped areas. So whether this could be one of the mechanisms, I don't know whether you can see some patterns in the data.
Yeah, that's interesting. We know, of course, like as you were saying, like the COVID protests were protesting about things which were negative events in other places. But it could also be that it's related to like a general dissatisfaction with like something that you feel is a bad policy. It's an interesting question. I wonder how we suppose that the hypothesis is that this is happening more, or that it is happening in more in certain areas than in other areas. I'm not sure how we could identify the types of protests which are not about local problems, but which are about problems in some other location. Maybe it can be done by the strikes. I mean, that would be like a sympathy strike. Yeah, yeah, it's an interesting point. We haven't thought at all about that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. I'm not seeing other questions. I guess I have one other question. It's not really a great last question because it's kind of a more of a minutia point because everybody's bringing up these good big picture type things. But I was just kind of wondering, have you looked at other ways of either measuring? So I'm wondering about using a discrete variable to define a protest. Is that really an appropriate measure? Like if one person is protesting as opposed to 1,000. And then secondly, kind of the nature of the information that's transmitted. Well, maybe I shouldn't say that, but in terms of how successful the protest is. Like if the message is there's a protest and the police came and beat everybody up, or the protest and nothing happened, seemed to be quite different. I don't know if these are things you can even look at with your data, but I was just wondering if these kinds of things are things you might have looked at.
Yeah, we tried that, but we don't have the outcome of the protest coded in many cases, but we do have it in a few cases. We tried seeing whether like successful protests are spreading more than other protests, but we didn't find any evidence. But basically, we just had too little data, so the standard errors were too big. We couldn't say much. For the dummy variable, we do have a measure of like the number of protesters, but those numbers are like very imprecise. And if we use them, like in some sense, it's easy to use a dummy variable in a regression. If we use like some sensor variable, like the number of protesters ending at 0, then we have to think about other econometrics issues related to that.
Yep.
I got it. Okay, well, we're at time, so I think rather than run over, I think we should just thank David, those of us who are still here. Thanks for a great presentation and kicking off the seminar series again. I'll send you, just as an aside, in case you're interested, I copied the comments in the chat. I'll send them along in an email, David.
Okay, that's great. Thanks.
Great. Okay. Thank you,
Okay,
everybody.
thank you so much. Thanks for all the
and,
comments. Thanks for the invitation.
Great. And our next talk, those who are here in 1 month, Julia Cage. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.